At St. Hope Memorial Hospital, the bustling emergency department never slept. Among the dedicated staff was Nurse Michelle Thompson, a highly skilled professional with 15 years of experience in critical care. Despite her impressive background and countless lives saved, she often faced an uphill battle for respect from certain colleagues. Dr. Richard Anderson strode through the emergency department like he owned it, his white coat pristine and his demeanor cold as ice. As the newly appointed head of emergency medicine, he carried himself with an air of superiority that made the staff uncomfortable. His reputation for being particularly dismissive of nursing staff, especially those of color, had already spread through the hospital grapevine. On this fateful Tuesday morning, the emergency department was overwhelmed with patients from a major traffic accident. Nurse Thompson was attending to an elderly patient who had been brought in with severe chest pain and labored breathing. Her instincts, honed by years of experience, told her something was seriously wrong beyond the obvious symptoms. "Dr. Anderson," she called out firmly as he passed by, "I need you to take a look at this patient immediately. His symptoms are concerning, and I believe we might be dealing with something critical." Dr. Anderson barely glanced at her, his lip curling slightly. "I'll determine what's critical and what's not, nurse. There are multiple trauma patients from the accident that need immediate attention." "Sir, with all due respect," Michelle persisted, her voice steady despite her rising frustration, "this patient's condition is deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure is dropping, and his breathing patterns are irregular. These symptoms suggest—" "Listen," Dr. Anderson cut her off sharply, his voice dripping with condescension, "I didn't spend 8 years in medical school to be lectured by a nurse about patient symptoms. Handle the basic care, and I'll get to this patient when I determine it's necessary." The other staff members nearby froze, the tension in the air palpable. Michelle stood her ground, her years of experience and dedication to patient care overriding any intimidation she might have felt. "Dr. Anderson," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of steel, "this patient needs immediate medical intervention. His symptoms strongly indicate a potential aortic dissection, and if we don't act now—" "Enough!" Dr. Anderson snapped, turning to face her fully. "Your job is to follow orders, not make diagnoses. If you can't handle that, perhaps you should reconsider your position here." Just then, the patient's monitor began beeping frantically. Michelle immediately rushed to the bedside, her training kicking in automatically. The patient's blood pressure had plummeted dangerously low, and his oxygen saturation was dropping rapidly. "Dr. Anderson," she called out urgently, "we're losing him." The commotion finally drew Dr. Anderson's attention. He hurried over, his face showing the first signs of concern as he looked at the monitors. As he began examining the patient, his expression shifted from dismissive to alarmed. "Get me a portable ultrasound, stat," he ordered, the urgency in his voice betraying his earlier nonchalance. The test confirmed what Michelle had suspected all along, a severe aortic dissection that required immediate surgical intervention. As the patient was being rushed to emergency surgery, Dr. Anderson stood frozen, the reality of his mistake beginning to sink in. Had he listened to Nurse Thompson's initial assessment, they could have caught this life-threatening condition much earlier. The next few hours were critical. The surgical team worked tirelessly to save the patient's life, while the emergency department continued its relentless pace. Michelle focused on her other patients, her professionalism never wavering despite the earlier confrontation. However, the incident had not gone unnoticed by the hospital staff, and whispers about Dr. Anderson's behavior spread quickly through the departments. What no one knew yet, including Dr. Anderson, was that this incident would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge his deepest-held beliefs and force him to confront his own prejudices. The true shock would come later, when he would discover something about this patient that would shake him to his core and forever change his perspective on healthcare, respect, and the value of every medical professional, regardless of their title or background. As the day shift drew to a close, Michelle gathered her belongings, her mind still on the patient in surgery. Despite the emotional toll of the day, she held her head high, knowing she had fought for what was right. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that would transform not just Dr. Anderson, but the entire culture of St. Hope Memorial Hospital. The following morning, Dr. Anderson arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, spent tossing and turning as he replayed the previous day's events in his mind. As he walked through the quiet corridors, the weight of his actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. The patient from yesterday, now identified as James Wilson, had survived the emergency surgery, but remained in critical condition in the ICU. Dr. Anderson found himself standing outside Mr. Wilson's room, staring through the glass at the monitors and equipment keeping the elderly man alive. "He's stable, but the next 48 hours are crucial," a familiar voice spoke behind him. It was Nurse Thompson, beginning her morning rounds. Her voice remained professional, showing no trace of yesterday's confrontation. Dr. Anderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Nurse Thompson, about yesterday." "The patient's family has arrived," she interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact. "They've been waiting to speak with you." In the ICU waiting room, Dr. Anderson found 3 people, an elderly woman with silver hair and dignified bearing, a middle-aged man in a military uniform, and a young woman wearing a white coat similar to his own. "Dr. Anderson?" The young woman stood up, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Catherine Wilson, Chief of Cardiology at Boston General. This is my mother, Mrs. Wilson, and my brother, Colonel Wilson." Dr. Anderson felt his world tilt slightly. The patient's daughter was not only a doctor but a highly respected cardiologist. The son, a high-ranking military officer, stood with the same quiet dignity as his mother. "Mr. Wilson, your father, he had an aortic dissection," Dr. Anderson began, his usual confidence wavering. "We performed emergency surgery." "Yes, we've reviewed his charts," Dr. Catherine Wilson interrupted, her voice cool. "Including the timestamps of when symptoms were first reported by Nurse Thompson and when intervention actually began. As a cardiologist, I'm particularly interested in that 45-minute gap." The colonel stepped forward, his military bearing impossible to miss. "Our father served as chief of surgery at this very hospital for 30 years. He mentored countless doctors, nurses, and medical students, always teaching them that healthcare is a collaborative effort, that every voice in the medical team matters." Mrs. Wilson, who had remained silent until now, spoke softly but with clear purpose. "My husband dedicated his life to building a culture of respect and excellence in this hospital. He believed that arrogance has no place in medicine, that it costs lives." Dr. Anderson felt the blood drain from his face. James Wilson, now he remembered the name from the hospital's history, from the plaques on the walls, from the stories older staff members told. The man he had dismissed so callously was a living legend in the medical community, known not just for his surgical skills but for his tireless efforts to promote equality and respect in healthcare. Back at the nurses' station, Michelle Thompson was updating patient charts when she overheard 2 nurses discussing Dr. Wilson's history at the hospital. Apparently, he had been a pioneer in promoting diversity in medical education, creating scholarship programs specifically for underrepresented minorities in healthcare. He had fought against systemic bias his entire career, making enemies among the old guard but earning deep respect from those who shared his vision of equal opportunity in medicine. The irony was almost too much to bear, that this man, who had spent his life fighting against medical elitism and racial bias, would become a victim of those very attitudes in his own hospital. Throughout the day, more hospital staff learned about the patient's identity. The atmosphere in the emergency department shifted noticeably. Older staff members shared stories about Dr. Wilson's kindness, his mentorship, his unwavering support for every member of the medical team regardless of their position or background. Dr. Anderson found himself stationed at the far end of the emergency department, trying to focus on his work while avoiding the knowing glances and whispered conversations. Each time he passed the nurses' station, each time he had to interact with the staff he had treated so dismissively, the weight of his actions grew heavier. Late that afternoon, he was reviewing charts when Nurse Thompson approached him again. "Dr. Wilson's latest labs show signs of potential complications," she reported, her voice steady and professional. "Would you like me to share my observations, or should I wait until you determine it's necessary?" The gentle rebuke in her words hit him like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Dr. Catherine Wilson appeared at the nurse's station, accompanied by the hospital's chief of medicine. "Dr. Anderson," the chief spoke gravely, "we need to discuss yesterday's incident. And while we're at it, perhaps we should review the multiple complaints about your behavior that have been filed over the past months. Join us in my office, please." As Dr. Anderson followed them down the corridor, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window, his perfect white coat, his carefully maintained appearance, all the external markers of medical authority he had hidden behind. For the first time, he saw something else in that reflection, a man whose arrogance had nearly cost a life, whose prejudices had betrayed everything the medical profession stood for. What he didn't know yet was that this meeting would mark the beginning of a profound transformation, not just in his professional life but in his understanding of what it truly means to be a healer. The lessons that lay ahead would challenge everything he thought he knew about medicine, about people, and about himself. The meeting in the chief of medicine's office lasted over 2 hours. Dr. Anderson sat rigid in his chair as Dr. Catherine Wilson methodically presented a compilation of incidents involving his behavior. Each documented case revealed a pattern of dismissiveness, particularly toward nurses and staff members of color. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to defend. "Your technical skills as a doctor are not in question," the chief of medicine stated, his voice heavy with disappointment. "But medicine is not just about technical proficiency. It's about leadership, teamwork, and most importantly, human dignity." Dr. Catherine Wilson opened a folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a younger James Wilson standing with a diverse group of medical professionals. "This was taken in 1985, she explained. "My father had just established the Wilson Initiative for Healthcare Equality. Do you know what prompted him to start this program?" When Dr. Anderson shook his head, she continued, "He witnessed a brilliant nurse being ignored when she tried to warn a doctor about a patient's deteriorating condition. The patient died. The nurse left medicine entirely. My father vowed that as long as he had any influence in this hospital, no healthcare worker would ever feel their voice didn't matter." The parallel to recent events hung heavily in the air. Dr. Anderson felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack. "We're placing you on administrative leave for 2 weeks, the chief announced. During this time, you'll participate in the hospital's intensive diversity and inclusion program. Additionally, you'll be shadowing various department members, nurses, technicians, orderlies, to understand their crucial roles in patient care. And," Dr. Catherine added firmly, "you'll be reviewing cases where medical errors occurred due to hierarchy-based communication failures. Starting with this one." She placed her father's current case file on the desk. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Nurse Thompson was checking on Dr. Wilson's vitals when Mrs. Wilson entered the room. The elderly woman sat quietly by her husband's bed, watching Michelle work with experienced eyes. "You know," Mrs. Wilson spoke softly, "James always said you can tell everything about a doctor's character by how they treat their nurses." She reached out and patted Michelle's hand. "Thank you for fighting for my husband." Michelle felt tears threatening to form but maintained her professional composure. "Dr. Wilson was one of the first administrators to support my nursing scholarship," she revealed. "I wouldn't be here without his belief in giving everyone a fair chance." Over the next few days, Dr. Anderson began his mandated program. Each morning, he reported to a different department, wearing not his white coat but standard scrubs. He followed nurses as they juggled multiple critical patients, watched technicians handle complex equipment with expertise, and observed the intricate dance of healthcare workers coordinating to save lives. On his 3rd day, he was assigned to shadow Nurse Thompson. The tension was palpable as she efficiently moved through her duties, explaining each step with clinical precision. They entered a room where a young patient was struggling to breathe. "Notice his nail beds," Michelle pointed out. "The slight blue tinge suggests early cyanosis. Combined with his increased work of breathing and the fact that his asthma inhaler is nearly empty, we might be heading toward a serious situation." Dr. Anderson found himself automatically dismissing her observation, but then stopped. He forced himself to look closer, to really listen. She was right, subtle signs he might have missed while rushing through his rounds. Later that day, they received news that Dr. Wilson had shown signs of improvement. As they stood outside his ICU room, Dr. Anderson watched Michelle efficiently adjust his medications and check his readings. "Why didn't you report me?" he finally asked. "Before this incident. You must have dealt with my behavior for months." Michelle paused her work but didn't turn around. "Because I believed that someday, something would make you understand what Dr. Wilson taught us all, that medicine is about more than just treating symptoms. It's about treating people with dignity, no matter who they are." Their conversation was interrupted by Colonel Wilson, who had come to visit his father. The military man observed them both, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Anderson," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I understand you're participating in the hospital's integration program?" "Yes, sir," Dr. Anderson replied, unconsciously responding to the colonel's authority. "You know, in the military, we learned that the strongest units are those where every member's voice is heard and respected. A private might spot something a colonel misses. In medicine, as in combat, pride and prejudice can be fatal flaws." As if to emphasize his point, Dr. Wilson's monitors suddenly showed a concerning change in heart rhythm. Before Dr. Anderson could speak, Michelle was already moving, her trained eyes catching details and her hands flying over the equipment. "Blood pressure's dropping," she reported calmly. "Possible reaction to the new medication protocol." This time, Dr. Anderson listened. Together, they stabilized Dr. Wilson's condition, working as a seamless team. When it was over, he realized something had shifted inside him. The hierarchies and prejudices that had seemed so important now felt meaningless in the face of what really mattered, saving lives. As his shadowing days continued, stories about Dr. Wilson's impact on the hospital kept emerging. An environmental services worker shared how Dr. Wilson had supported her daughter's dream of becoming a doctor. A respiratory therapist remembered how he had stood up to board members who questioned the need for diversity initiatives. Each story, each interaction, each saved life began to strip away layers of Dr. Anderson's prejudice, revealing uncomfortable truths about himself that he could no longer ignore. But this was just the beginning of his transformation, and the hardest lessons were yet to come. 1 week into his administrative leave, Dr. Anderson found himself in the hospital's basement archives, surrounded by dusty files and photographs. As part of his mandated education, he was researching the hospital's history of diversity initiatives. What he discovered shook him to his core. Among the yellowed papers was a newspaper article from 1975. The headline read, "St. Hope Memorial Refuses Treatment to Minority Patients." The accompanying photograph showed a young Dr. James Wilson standing at a podium, publicly condemning the hospital's policies. He had risked his promising career to fight against systemic discrimination. "That article almost got him fired," a voice said behind him. Dr. Anderson turned to find Mrs. Wilson standing in the doorway of the archive room. She walked in slowly, her hand trailing along the filing cabinets with familiarity. "I remember that day," she continued, pulling out a chair. "James came home, terrified he'd lost everything. But he said some things were worth losing everything for." She fixed Dr. Anderson with a penetrating gaze. "Do you know what happened to the patient they turned away that day?" Dr. Anderson shook his head, unable to speak. "She died in the parking lot. She was a nurse herself, had spent 20 years caring for others. But when she needed help, the color of her skin mattered more than her humanity. Mrs. Wilson's voice carried decades of pain. That's why James devoted his life to changing the system. He understood that prejudice in healthcare isn't just about hurt feelings, it's about life and death. Meanwhile, upstairs in the ICU, Dr. Wilson's condition was showing steady improvement. Nurse Thompson was updating his charts when Dr. Catherine Wilson entered, carrying a thick folder. "I've been reviewing my father's personal files," Catherine said, sitting down heavily. "Did you know he kept records of every healthcare worker he mentored? Every story, every struggle, every triumph." She opened the folder, revealing hundreds of photographs and letters. "Including yours, Michelle." Michelle paused her work, emotion flickering across her face. "He wrote me letters of recommendation for nursing school," she said softly. "When others said I wouldn't make it, he saw something in me." "He saw the future of healthcare," Catherine replied, pulling out a photograph. It showed a teenage Michelle in a hospital volunteer uniform, standing proudly next to Dr. Wilson. "He always said that talent and compassion don't know color or class." Back in the archives, Dr. Anderson continued his research, each document revealing more about the man he had so carelessly dismissed. He found records of Dr. Wilson's battles with the hospital board, fighting for equal pay for nurses, demanding diversity in hiring practices, establishing mentorship programs for minority students. A security guard passing by stopped at the door. "Dr. Wilson gave my daughter her first stethoscope," he shared unexpectedly. "Told her that anyone with a caring heart and willing mind could become a healer. She's in medical school now." As the day progressed, Dr. Anderson found himself drawn back to the ICU. He stood outside Dr. Wilson's room, watching the medical team work. Every interaction, every careful check of vital signs, every gentle adjustment of equipment, it was a symphony of healthcare professionals working in perfect harmony, regardless of their titles or backgrounds. Colonel Wilson appeared beside him, still in his military uniform. "Quite a different view from down here, isn't it?" he observed. "When you're not looking down on people, you can actually see them." Dr. Anderson nodded, words failing him. The colonel continued, "You know what my father taught me about leadership? That true authority doesn't come from making others feel small, it comes from helping others reach their full potential." Just then, alarms began blaring from Dr. Wilson's room. Michelle rushed past them, calling out clear, precise observations about the patient's condition. This time, Dr. Anderson didn't hesitate. He followed her lead, working alongside her as an equal. After they stabilized Dr. Wilson, Michelle began documenting the incident. Dr. Anderson watched her practiced hands move efficiently over the charts, noting how she included every detail that might be important for the next shift. "I've been reviewing cases," he said quietly, "where communication failures led to patient deaths. Cases where doctors ignored nurses' warnings, where prejudice clouded judgment." He paused, struggling with his next words. "Cases exactly like what I almost did to Dr. Wilson." Michelle looked up, her expression professional but compassionate. "The difference is, those cases are in the past. You have a chance to write a different ending to this one." Later that evening, Dr. Anderson sat in the hospital's chapel, surrounded by silence. The weight of his realizations pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought about all the times he had dismissed concerns from nurses, all the subtle ways he had made colleagues feel inferior, all the potential warnings he might have missed due to his prejudice. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. It was Mrs. Wilson. "James always said that the hardest person to heal is yourself," she said softly. "But recognizing the illness is the first step toward recovery." As she turned to leave, she placed something on the chapel bench beside him. It was a photograph of Dr. Wilson from his early days as a surgeon, standing with his first diverse team of healthcare professionals. Their faces shone with pride and purpose, united in their mission to heal. Dr. Anderson picked up the photograph with trembling hands, seeing for the first time what real medical leadership looked like. His transformation was far from complete, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The question was, would it be enough to earn back the trust he had so carelessly thrown away? As the second week of his administrative leave began, Dr. Anderson found himself volunteering for extra shadowing shifts, particularly in the emergency department. The staff's initial tension around him had gradually shifted to cautious acceptance as they witnessed his genuine efforts to learn and change. One morning, while working alongside Michelle, they received a critical patient, a young woman from a low-income neighborhood, presenting with unusual symptoms. The resident on duty seemed ready to dismiss it as anxiety, but Michelle caught Dr. Anderson's eye meaningfully. "What are you thinking?" he asked her, surprising both himself and the surrounding staff with his genuine interest in her assessment. "Her symptoms don't align with anxiety," Michelle explained, pointing out subtle signs that others had missed. "Given her family history and these irregular readings, I suspect something cardiovascular." Dr. Anderson listened intently, asking follow-up questions and engaging in real dialogue. Together, they discovered a rare heart condition that might have gone undiagnosed. As they worked to stabilize the patient, he realized that this collaborative approach had possibly saved another life. Later that day, Dr. Catherine Wilson found him in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cold cup of coffee. She sat down across from him, placing a worn leather journal on the table. "This was my father's personal journal from his early days as a surgeon," she said. "He wrote about his own struggles with prejudice, not just what he fought against, but what he found within himself." She opened the journal to a marked page and began reading. "Today I realized that my own biases nearly cost a patient their life. I was so certain that a young resident couldn't spot something I had missed. Pride is a disease that affects many doctors, and its symptoms can be fatal, not just for our patients, but for the soul of medicine itself." Dr. Anderson felt a chill run down his spine at the parallels. "How did he change?" he asked quietly. "One person at a time," Catherine replied. "One lesson at a time. One day at a time." She slid the journal across the table. "He would want you to read this." Meanwhile, in the ICU, Dr. Wilson's condition had improved enough to reduce his sedation. Mrs. Wilson sat by his bedside, holding his hand as Michelle performed her regular checks. They shared comfortable silence, broken only by the steady beeping of monitors. "You know," Mrs. Wilson said suddenly, when James first started his diversity initiatives, many of his colleagues stopped speaking to him. They called him a troublemaker, said he was destroying medical tradition. She smiled sadly. But for every door that closed, he opened 10 more for others. Michelle adjusted Dr. Wilson's foreline with practiced care. "I remember when I first started here," she shared. "Some doctors wouldn't even look at my reports. Dr. Wilson noticed and started asking for my assessments during rounds, making sure my voice was heard." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Anderson, who arrived for his scheduled ICU rotation. He had Dr. Wilson's journal tucked under his arm, its pages marked with sticky notes. The changes in him were subtle but noticeable, his posture less rigid, his expression more open, his white coat conspicuously absent. As he joined Michelle in reviewing Dr. Wilson's latest test results, a young nurse's aide approached nervously with an observation about another patient. Instead of dismissing her, Dr. Anderson listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked her for bringing it to his attention. Colonel Wilson, who had been watching from the doorway, nodded approvingly. "You know what's interesting about military medicine?" he said, entering the room. "In the field, rank means nothing when a medic spots something crucial. The best officers learn to listen to everyone, because you never know who might see what you've missed." That evening, after his shift, Dr. Anderson found himself in Dr. Wilson's office, now preserved as something of a memorial to his legacy. The walls were covered with photographs of the countless lives he had touched, letters of gratitude from former students and ments, and awards for his pioneering work in healthcare equality. On his desk sat a simple plaque with words that Dr. Anderson had passed 100 times without really seeing. In medicine, we are all students, and our patients are our greatest teachers. As he stood there, absorbed in reflection, Michelle appeared at the door with Dr. Wilson's latest test results. "His numbers are improving," she reported. "The new treatment protocol is working." Dr. Anderson turned to her, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I've been reading his journal," he said, gesturing to the worn book. "There's an entry from 1992 about a nurse who kept pushing for a patient's symptoms to be taken seriously. The doctor ignored her, and..." He trailed off. "And?" Michelle prompted quietly. "The patient died." But instead of hiding it or shifting blame, Dr. Wilson used it as a teaching moment. He brought it up in every orientation, every staff meeting, making sure everyone understood that hierarchy in healthcare should never trump human life. He met her eyes directly. "Thank you for not giving up on your patient." "On Dr. Wilson." "On me." Just then, Mrs. Wilson appeared, her face glowing with emotion. "He's awake," she announced. "James is awake and asking for his team." The news spread through the hospital like a wave of hope. Staff members who had been touched by Dr. Wilson's kindness and mentorship gathered near the ICU, their faces reflecting a mixture of joy and anticipation. As Dr. Anderson watched the celebration unfold, he felt the full weight of his journey over the past 2 weeks. He had entered this story as a different person, someone so sure of his superiority that he had nearly caused a tragedy. Now, standing among the diverse tapestry of healthcare workers that Dr. Wilson had helped create, he understood that true medical excellence wasn't about individual brilliance but about the strength of the whole team. But his journey wasn't over. The real test would come in the days ahead, as he faced the man whose life he had nearly destroyed through his arrogance, the man who, unknowingly, had already begun to save his soul. The moment of truth arrived sooner than Dr. Anderson expected. Standing outside Dr. Wilson's ICU room, he watched through the glass as the legendary surgeon slowly regained his strength. The past 2 weeks had felt like both an eternity and an instant, a transformation that had stripped away everything he thought he knew about being a doctor. Michelle stood beside him, reviewing the morning's charts. "His cognitive functions are all normal," she reported. "He's been asking questions about the hospital, the staff, his patients from before the incident." "Has anyone told him?" Dr. Anderson couldn't finish the sentence. "About what happened?" Michelle shook her head. "The family thought it best to wait until he was stronger. But he's a doctor, he's already piecing things together from the staff's behavior and his own symptoms." Inside the room, Dr. Wilson was sitting up, speaking quietly with his wife. Despite his recent brush with death, his eyes remained sharp and observant, taking in every detail of his surroundings. When he noticed Dr. Anderson through the glass, he gestured for him to enter. Dr. Anderson's feet felt like lead as he walked into the room. Mrs. Wilson squeezed her husband's hand and excused herself, passing Dr. Anderson with an encouraging nod. The two doctors were left alone, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. "So," Dr. Wilson's voice was weak but clear, "you're the one who almost killed me." Dr. Anderson's carefully prepared speech disappeared from his mind. "Yes, sir," was all he could manage. "Sit down, son," Dr. Wilson gestured to the chair beside his bed. "My daughter tells me you've been spending time in the archives, reading about the hospital's history." "Yes, sir. I found your journal, your writings about changing the culture of medicine." "Ah," Dr. Wilson smiled slightly. "And what did you learn?" Before Dr. Anderson could respond, the door opened and a group of medical students filed in, led by their instructor. They stopped short at the sight of the two doctors, but Dr. Wilson waved them forward. "Perfect timing," he said. "This is a teaching moment." He turned back to Dr. Anderson. "Tell them what you learned. Tell them about the mistake that almost cost my life." The students listened intently as Dr. Anderson recounted the events of that fateful day. His voice shook as he described his dismissal of Michelle's concerns, his arrogance, his prejudice. With each word, the weight of his actions became more real. "But that's not the real mistake," Dr. Wilson interrupted. "The real mistake was made long before that day. Tell them about the system that taught you to believe your title made you infallible. Tell them about the culture that made you think the color of someone's skin determined their competence." In the hallway outside, hospital staff began to gather, drawn by the impromptu lesson. Michelle stood in the doorway, her presence a testament to the importance of this moment. "I was wrong," Dr. Anderson admitted, his voice carrying to everyone listening. "Not just about that day, but about everything. I thought being a good doctor meant never being wrong, never listening to those I considered beneath me. I failed to understand that medicine is a team effort, that every voice matters, that saving lives requires more than just technical knowledge." Dr. Wilson nodded slowly. "When I was chief of surgery," he said, "I kept a list of every patient we lost because someone's voice wasn't heard, because prejudice clouded judgment, because hierarchy was valued over human life. Each case taught me that the deadliest disease in medicine isn't cancer or heart failure, it's arrogance." He gestured to the gathered crowd. "Look around this room. Every person here, every nurse, every technician, every student, has the potential to save a life or spot something crucial. The moment we forget that, the moment we let our biases determine whose voice matters, we betray our oath as healers." A young nurse raised her hand hesitantly. "Dr. Wilson, how do we change things? How do we fight against these biases?" "The same way we treat any chronic disease," Dr. Wilson replied. "Through constant vigilance, through recognition of symptoms, through daily commitment to improvement." He turned to Dr. Anderson. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to make us see our own illness. The question is, what will you do with this awareness?" Dr. Anderson met his gaze steadily. "I want to be part of the cure," he said. "I want to help change the system that made me think my prejudices were normal, that made me value status over safety." "It won't be easy," Dr. Wilson warned. "Change never is. You'll face resistance, skepticism, maybe even hostility. Are you prepared for that?" "I have to be," Dr. Anderson replied. "Because I've seen the cost of staying silent, of maintaining the status quo. I've seen how close we came to losing someone invaluable because I was too proud to listen." Dr. Wilson reached for his water glass, and without hesitation, Dr. Anderson stood to help him. The simple act of assistance, doctor helping doctor, human helping human, carried more meaning than any words could convey. "You know," Dr. Wilson said after taking a sip, 30 years ago, I was you. I was the young hotshot surgeon who thought he knew everything. Then one day, a janitor noticed something wrong with a patient's color. I almost dismissed him, but something made me listen. That patient lived because someone I would normally have ignored spoke up." The room had grown completely silent, every person absorbed in his words. Even the usual hospital noises seemed muted, as if the universe itself was listening to this lesson in humility and growth. "That day changed me," Dr. Wilson continued. "It started me on a path that would define my career, my legacy. Sometimes, Dr. Anderson, our worst moments can become our most important teachers." Outside the window, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the hospital room. In that golden light, Dr. Anderson saw the faces of everyone he had wronged through his arrogance, everyone whose voices he had dismissed. But he also saw the possibility of redemption, of change, of a future where medicine truly lived up to its noble calling. The lesson wasn't over, but a new chapter was beginning. And somewhere in that ICU room, between the beeping monitors and the whispered conversations, the future of healthcare was being reshaped, one changed heart at a time. In the days following his conversation with Dr. Wilson, Dr. Anderson's transformation became increasingly evident to everyone at St. Hope Memorial. His administrative leave was coming to an end, and the hospital staff watched with interest to see how his return to regular duties would unfold. One morning, as he prepared for his first official shift back in the emergency department, he found himself arriving early, just as Michelle was ending her night shift. She was training a new nurse, carefully explaining the importance of certain protocols and procedures. "The small details matter," Michelle was saying. "Sometimes the smallest observation can save a life." She caught Dr. Anderson's eye as he passed, and for the first time, there was warmth in her greeting. The emergency department was typically busy that morning. A young resident was struggling with a difficult diagnosis, his frustration evident as he reviewed conflicting symptoms. Dr. Anderson watched as the resident dismissed a suggestion from an experienced nurse, and suddenly saw himself in the young doctor's attitude. "Dr. Chen," he called out, approaching the situation. "May I offer some advice?" The resident looked up, surprised. "I notice Nurse Rodriguez has worked in this department for 15 years. Perhaps we should hear her thoughts on these symptoms?" The nurse's insight proved crucial in reaching the correct diagnosis. As they worked together to stabilize the patient, Dr. Anderson could feel the shift in the department's energy. It was a small moment, but its impact rippled through the staff. Later that day, he found himself back in Dr. Wilson's room for a different kind of rounds. The elder physician was continuing to improve, now sitting up in a chair and reviewing hospital policies on his tablet. "I hear you're making quite an impression downstairs," Dr. Wilson commented, looking up from his reading. "The nurses are talking about your changed approach." "I'm trying," Dr. Anderson replied honestly. "But I worry it's not enough." "How do you maintain this awareness, this vigilance against old habits?" Dr. Wilson set aside his tablet. "Let me tell you about a tradition I started years ago. Every morning, before I began my rounds, would look at a photograph on my office wall. It showed the family of a patient we lost because of medical arrogance. It reminded me that every decision we make, every voice we dismiss, has real consequences." He paused, reaching for a folder beside his bed. "Which is why I want to show you something." Inside were photographs of families, dozens of them. These are the lives saved because someone spoke up. Because a nurse noticed something crucial. Because a technician questioned a reading. Because hierarchy took a back seat to humanity. Dr. Anderson carefully looked through the photos, each one telling a story of collaboration and respect. He stopped at one particular image, a group photo of the emergency department staff from just a few years ago. In the center stood Michelle, receiving an award for excellence in patient care. "She should have received that recognition much earlier," Dr. Wilson commented. "But prejudice delayed the acknowledgement of her skills. How many other talented healthcare workers are we failing to recognize, to listen to, because of our biases?" The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Catherine Wilson, arriving for her daily check on her father's progress. She carried with her a stack of papers that turned out to be new protocol proposals for the hospital. "The board is reviewing changes to our communication procedures," she explained. "Dad, we're using your case as a catalyst for systemic change. Dr. Anderson, we'd like your input, given your unique perspective on this issue." The three doctors spent the next hour discussing practical ways to break down hierarchical barriers in medical communication. Dr. Anderson shared insights from his recent experiences, pointing out subtle forms of bias he had never noticed before his transformation. "What strikes me now," he reflected, "is how many near misses we must have had. How many times did we almost lose patients because someone felt they couldn't speak up? That's why documentation is crucial," Dr. Wilson said. "Every incident, every near miss, every time bias or hierarchy impacts patient care, it needs to be recorded and addressed. Systemic problems require systemic solutions." As they talked, more staff members began dropping by the room. An environmental services worker shared how he had noticed a patient's declining condition but had been afraid to speak up. A pharmacy technician described catching a potentially dangerous medication interaction because she felt empowered to question a prescription. The room became a kind of informal forum, with healthcare workers from all levels sharing their experiences and insights. Dr. Anderson found himself taking notes, realizing that each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, the complex picture of how healthcare really worked. Mrs. Wilson appeared with afternoon medications, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "This is what James always wanted," she said softly to Dr. Anderson. "A hospital where every voice matters, where healing is truly a collaborative effort." As the day wound down, Dr. Anderson made one final round through the emergency department. He stopped at each station, speaking with staff members he would have barely acknowledged just weeks ago. He learned about their experiences, their insights, their daily challenges. Near the end of his shift, a critical case came in, a patient with complex symptoms that didn't quite fit any standard diagnosis. Instead of rushing to judgment, Dr. Anderson gathered his team, including nurses, technicians, and support staff. He listened to each perspective, weighing their observations carefully. Together, they identified a rare condition that might have been missed if any single voice had been ignored. As they worked to stabilize the patient, Dr. Anderson caught Michelle's approving glance. "You know," she said as they updated the patient's charts, "Dr. Wilson would say this is what medicine is supposed to look like. Not a hierarchy, but a symphony, every instrument essential to the whole." Dr. Anderson nodded, understanding now what he had missed for so long. The true measure of a doctor wasn't in their ability to command, but in their capacity to collaborate, to listen, to learn from every member of the healthcare team. As he prepared to leave for the day, he paused by the emergency department entrance. The same doors he had once strode through with such arrogance now represented something different, a threshold between the old way of practicing medicine and a new, more inclusive approach. But this wasn't the end of his journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to either reinforce old biases or strengthen new habits. The real test would be in the days, weeks, and years to come, in the countless small moments where choice between pride and humility could make the difference between life and death. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, St. Hope Memorial Hospital was hosting a special ceremony. The hospital's main auditorium was filled to capacity with staff members from every department, medical students, and healthcare professionals from across the city. Dr. Wilson, now fully recovered, sat in the front row with his family. His presence commanded respect, but there was a new dimension to it. His near-death experience had transformed him from a hospital legend into a living symbol of the change needed in medical culture. Dr. Anderson stood at the podium, looking out over the gathered crowd. Gone was the arrogant stance, replaced by a posture of genuine humility. He was about to deliver a keynote speech at the launch of the hospital's new Every Voice Matters initiative, a comprehensive program designed to break down hierarchical barriers in healthcare communication. 6 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I almost killed a patient because I thought my title made me infallible." That patient wasn't just any doctor, he was Dr. James Wilson, the very man who had spent decades fighting against the kind of arrogance I embodied. The audience sat in rapt attention as he continued, "But this isn't just about one near-tragic incident. It's about the countless lives we put at risk every day when we let prejudice and hierarchy silence vital voices in healthcare." Michelle sat in the audience, surrounded by her nursing colleagues. Over the past months, she had worked closely with both Dr. Wilson and Dr. Anderson to develop new protocols for cross-disciplinary communication in the hospital. Today, Dr. Anderson continued, "We're not just launching a program, we're committing to a fundamental change in how we practice medicine. Every person in this room, regardless of their title or position, has the potential to save a life. Every observation matters. Every voice counts." He gestured to a large screen behind him, which displayed photographs of healthcare teams in action, nurses collaborating with doctors, technicians working alongside surgeons, support staff contributing crucial observations. "Since that day 6 months ago, we've documented 37 cases where potential medical errors were prevented because someone who would have previously stayed silent felt empowered to speak up. That's 37 families who didn't have to receive devastating news. 37 lives saved not by individual brilliance, but by collective wisdom. The presentation continued with real examples, stories from the emergency department, the ICU, the operating rooms. Each case demonstrated how breaking down hierarchical barriers had improved patient care. Dr. Wilson slowly made his way to the podium, supported by his wife. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but he gestured for them to sit. Dr. Anderson's story, he said, his voice strong despite his recent recovery, is not unique. Every day, in hospitals across the world, brilliant healthcare workers remain silent because they fear the consequences of speaking up. Every day, patients suffer because we value titles over truth. He turned to Dr. Anderson with a warm smile. But every day is also an opportunity for change. Every interaction is a chance to choose humility over arrogance, collaboration over hierarchy. The ceremony continued with the official unveiling of new hospital protocols. Every department would now have regular rounds where all staff members, regardless of position, were encouraged to share observations. Anonymous reporting systems were strengthened to protect those who spoke up about concerns. Training programs were established to help healthcare workers recognize and overcome their own biases. After the ceremony, Dr. Anderson found himself in the emergency department, where it had all begun. The space felt different now, not just physically, with the new communication boards and collaborative workstations, but in its very atmosphere. Michelle approached him with a challenging case, a patient with symptoms that didn't quite add up. Together, they gathered a team that included a respiratory therapist, a pharmacy technician, and a new nurse. Each contributor offered their perspective, building a complete picture that led to an accurate diagnosis. Later that evening, Dr. Anderson visited Dr. Wilson in his office. The elder physician was reviewing applications for the hospital's expanded mentorship program, an initiative aimed at supporting healthcare workers from underrepresented backgrounds. "You know," Dr. Wilson said, looking up from his papers, "when I was lying in that ICU bed, I wasn't angry about what had happened. I was sad that after all these years, the disease of medical arrogance was still claiming victims." "But you turned it into an opportunity for change," Dr. Anderson replied. "You used your own near tragedy to create something positive. That's what good medicine is about," Dr. Wilson smiled. "Taking something painful and using it to heal. Your transformation has inspired others to examine their own biases, their own assumptions about who deserves to be heard." As if to prove his point, they heard a commotion in the hallway. A young environmental services worker had noticed something concerning about a patient's condition and was confidently reporting it to the medical team. Dr. Anderson watched through the window as the team took the observation seriously, immediately acting on the information. "That's the future of healthcare," Dr. Wilson said softly. "Not a pyramid with doctors at the top, but a circle where every person contributes to the healing process." The day ended with a small gathering in the hospital's garden. Staff members from all departments mingled freely, sharing stories and insights. Dr. Anderson watched as barriers of rank and position dissolved, replaced by genuine respect and collaboration. Mrs. Wilson approached him, carrying a framed photograph. It showed the emergency department team from the day they had saved her husband, doctors, nurses, technicians, all working together as equals. "James wants you to hang this in your office," she said. "To remind you, and everyone who visits, that medicine is a team sport. Every player matters." As the sun set over St. Hope Memorial Hospital, Dr. Anderson reflected on his journey. The arrogant doctor who had walked these halls 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true medical excellence comes not from individual brilliance, but from the collective wisdom of an entire healthcare community. The story of his transformation would be told in medical schools and hospitals, not as a tale of personal redemption, but as a reminder that in healthcare, every voice matters, every observation counts, and every person has the potential to save a life. The disease of medical arrogance had claimed many victims over the years, but here, in this hospital, the cure had finally taken root. And somewhere in the emergency department, a new shift was beginning, carrying forward this legacy of humility, respect, and collaborative healing, one patient, one voice, one life at a time.